with shoulder pain, the first thing that you want to try to do is you want to try to establish exactly where the shoulder pain is coming from and what exactly is involved structurally as a result of that. There's probably more than a dozen different types of diagnoses that can come from the shoulder and can be problematic if not properly assessed. And so I always tell people you need to get a proper assessment to identify the source of the complaint or where you're experiencing your limitations, then develop a course of action. It's also an acute chronic type of situation where you can have an acute problem, like I jump for a ball and I land and my shoulder pops out of the joint and I have a glenohumeral dislocation that needs to be reset or reduced. That's a very clear-cut strategy for how you're going to manage that, right? We're going to immobilize it and then over time reestablish our movement patterns, our strength, and our functional abilities. However, when it's chronic in nature, like people that do repetitive actions like rowers and swimmers, these people have consistent chronic inflammatory processes in their shoulder such that the tissue changes over time with age. And so it's important to identify which structures are at fault and how they are being either mismanaged or improperly utilized so that they become inflamed. In many cases, this is also a problem that relates to the cervical spine and the relationship between the shoulder joint and the cervical spine. And this has a lot to do with our posture. If you think about the way that we sit forward, this can cause tightness in my anterior musculature in front of my shoulder. As a result of that, I can also get weakness in the posterior aspect of my shoulder as well. And so I can have an imbalance between the front and the back of my shoulder, which makes it harder for me to lift my arm straight up over my head. And so when I'm doing things like throwing a ball or swimming, I develop what's called an impingement syndrome, which means there's pinching of the tissue in there because I have malalignment in the structures around the shoulder. That's a result of my posture. And so oftentimes I tell people that we have to work on your postural alignment, and then we have to work on reestablishing the balance between the anterior musculature and the posterior musculature. In many cases where people have chronic shoulder pain, that's actually the case. One thing I want to mention about shoulder pain that's also important, especially as we get older, is that there are often fear avoidant behaviors that come with moving the shoulder. There's something called a frozen shoulder or adhesive capsulitis that is a very common condition from people who develop shoulder pain and then say, well, I'm just not going to move my arm because it hurts when I move my arm. And then all of a sudden, a couple of weeks go by and they can't lift their arm at all. This is very common in the older population and something that we ultimately want to try to avoid. It's extremely important that we continue to move and maintain the movement patterns in our shoulders because we have so many different degrees of freedom in this joint relative to our other joints in our body. We have to maintain all of those, but we have to do those in a safe way and we have to do it properly. And so working with specialists that can teach that instruction is critical for overcoming these chronic conditions.